So if we are to look at the role played by globalization and various global forces in contemporary civil wars, one could begin by identifying a whole raft of significant enablers of these conflicts that have a global character. The first of these would be the significance of the arms trade, both in its legal and illegal forms. Here there is undoubtedly a significant legacy of the Cold War. Vast weapon stocks, particularly in the Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc, were effectively recycled into the global market at the aftermath of the Cold War, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, with the end of a prospect of a major interstate war between the West and the East, and economies that were often in a very poorly state in the East. Weapon stocks flooded the global market, many of them ending up in conflict areas in Asia and Africa. Beyond this legacy of Cold War stocks, we have, of course, a lively arms trade that continues today, or more contemporary weapons perhaps, all of which are an important dimension of conflict in developing countries, where, generally speaking, weapons are not being produced locally, they are being imported. A second factor, a very important one, are the export markets available for valuable natural resources and export commodities. So whether it is diamonds, rare minerals, oil, timber, rubber, narcotics, there's a raft of resources which are sometimes available in significant amounts in developing countries that become a very important driver of conflict. They become often the focus of attention of belligerents because of the vast profits that these commodities can command. And the reason they can command vast profits is precisely because they are tapped into global markets. These resources are not for local domestic consumption in the conflict areas, they are for export to the world market. Another channel might be the various remittances and assistance from foreign migrants and diaspora. We know, for instance, in a variety of countries, Somalia is one example, that there are very significant flows of income coming back from developed countries where populations originally from these areas now live and work. Many of them, of course, send money back to support their local families. Some of them may directly invest in supporting political movements on the ground, and given disparities of income and wealth, these sums are actually very significant and enter into the local political economy in ways that can sometimes be a driver of conflict. Then we have, of course, the involvement or the assistance of foreign governments. Within Africa, it's well known that local states often have a stake in what is going on. We might look at the example of Congo, where at various moments the states of Rwanda or Uganda have sent forces on the ground, have backed one side or another along various ethnic lines or according to defined state interests, and are significant players in the persistence of these conflicts. In other parts of the world, one could point to the role that Pakistan has played in Afghanistan. The Pakistani have or at least parts of the Pakistani state and the intelligence services there have had a long-standing relationship with the Taliban and see an interest in the Pakistani state, or at least in parts of the Pakistani state, in supporting this. Afghanistan has long been, of course, a buffer state between various other states and a terrain in which other states have competed. Finally, of course, there's the role of former colonial powers. It plays a major role, particularly in Africa, maybe in some parts of Asia. The role of former French colonialists or British colonialists, who still play very important roles behind the scenes, who still exert considerable economic power and who therefore are one of the global factors in these conflict areas. And finally, there is the role of humanitarian assistance. Now, humanitarian assistance, at face value, is something that's introduced in these conflict areas to remedy these situations, or at least to bring some kind of succor to the suffering of people there. But in many cases, or at least a number of them, humanitarian assistance can actually contribute to the endurance of a conflict by creating a new resource that can be competed over. It's not possible to distribute humanitarian assistance most of the time in those regions without having to deal with local authorities or with local strongmen. And so humanitarian assistance can have unintended effects that are not those desired by those who initiate it. It may in fact serve to make a conflict persist rather than bring it to an end. In other cases, camps, for instance, have been occupied. So neighboring camps next to Rwanda in the aftermath of the genocide were occupied by some of the individuals responsible for the genocide, who therefore could escape persecution, or at least perhaps a judicial pursuit in the aftermath of the genocide. All of which is to say that foreign intervention into these areas is never a straightforward thing, and that the best of intentions can lead to quite undesired outcomes. It is, I think, here particularly important to insist on the rationality of protagonists in civil war. A rationality that is easy enough to discern when we identify the various structural incentives and political economy underpinning them. Christopher Kramer, for instance, says that civil war, or more broadly violence in developing countries, is not irrational or meaningless, nor are they outbursts of backwardness, a characterization we might recognize in a number of media treatments of conflicts, which all too quickly present these conflicts as senseless, perhaps even attributable to a lack of civilization or culture in those countries, and therefore some conflicts that we simply cannot understand from a rational perspective. Kramer says, not at all. Violence in all these contexts all too often makes sense. And so before we rush to the judgment that these conflicts are irrational or atavistic, I think it's very important to try to pierce the logic of these conflicts and to see where they might indeed make sense. For instance, one could look at the figure of the warlord associated with many conflicts in the developing world. And if we look closely, very quickly, we can see that the emergence of a figure such as the warlord does not have to be understood as a lapse into senseless barbarity. That rather, it can be understood as an outcome of an active and rational search for new strategies for rule by local elites. A strategy which involves seizing commercial and political opportunities by developing new domestic and international networks which circumvent the traditional state vessel. Here we need a little bit of historical background, in particularly the African context. One of the consequences of the very rapid decolonization that followed the Second World War is that many of the countries that emerged from this process were unprepared for self-rule. They had always been ruled and governed as adjuncts of colonial empires. So these were not states that were designed to be independent. In fact, they were quite the opposite. They were designed to be in the service of the colonial empires. And very often the structures of the countries had been designed in such a way as to prevent the emergence of autonomous power. The economies, notably, had been run to serve the interests of colonial powers. So most colonies, in fact, were often unprofitable and not geared towards, again, any form of independence. Inherited states and the territorial boundaries that they possessed were moreover the creation of the colonizers and generally fractionalized existing or pre-existing societies. Very deliberate processes of colonial divide and rule had been employed. And of course this is reflected by the sometimes very stark straight lines we can see in different borders in Africa. These were drawn across the map in Europe, to divide it between the major European powers, and very often it was done in such a fashion as to deliberately divide existing social and cultural groupings, precisely to prevent the emergence of a domestic local counterpower to the imperial forces. And so, because of this, the kind of legacy states, unsurprisingly, were not always very well suited to independence. The local elites have tended to view the state as an instrument of parochial interest rather than one of national interest. And the Cold War, the context in which these states became independent, generally led to the establishment of what's referred to as patron-client relationships. That's to say, local governments would trade the access to their resources, to various investment opportunities, and granted political allegiance in exchange for economic, financial, or military support. So in the context of the Cold War, this meant either dealing with the Americans or dealing with the Soviets. So local elites would declare themselves to be socialists or communists in order to curry favor with the Soviets and receive support in return. In fact, many of these elites showed themselves to be quite skillful in playing one side against the other, getting as much as they could from both the West and the East. In some cases, this of course would lead to the breakout of proxy wars between Cold War enemies. So whether it's in Angola, in Ethiopia, in Mozambique, or in Afghanistan, conflicts erupted in which one side was backed by the Soviet Union, one side by the West. Now, when the Cold War ended, this meant quite a dramatic and sudden decline in the support of these post-colonial states. The Soviet Union had disintegrated, was no longer able to project itself internationally in this way, and so abandoned most of its patron states or client states. The United States, conversely, the West more generally, no longer under the pressure of the Soviet Union, also did not necessarily need to extend as much assistance as it did in the past. So it left local elites seeking desperately new sources of power, wealth, and legitimacy. Accordingly, as William Renner puts it, warlord politics should be understood in terms of Africa's reintegration into global markets, largely as a consequence of the reconfiguration and further externalization of the old Cold War patron-client political accommodation. In other words, local elites looked for new ways to ground themselves, to retain power, to establish forms of legitimacy. And since they could no longer go to the United States or to the Soviet Union and take sides in the context of the Cold War, the most obvious way in which to gain authority and maintain power was to play the game of the emerging globalization and to integrate global markets. And of course, this was all, of course, facilitated further by the various economic measures that were pushed internationally under what became known as the Washington Consensus, the various moves towards marketization and deregulation, the various donor and creditor requirements imposed by the IMF and the World Bank, all of which contributed to also weaken state structures in many developing countries under the guise of economic liberalization. As a result, in conflict areas, large parts of the estimated production of countries became produced outside of conventional economic practice. That's to say, outside of a legal framework, outside of public regulation. In the early 2000s, 90% of the Angolan economy was the black economy. In Somalia, today, more or less, the totality of the country is outside of legally and publicly regulated economy. So the integration was really into a kind of global shadow economy. And for those who were able to lead this integration, the rewards were considerable. It's estimated that Charles Taylor of Liberia was able to, in the period of his presidency of Liberia, in the war between 1997 and 2003, was able to accumulate $400 million from diamonds and a general pilfering of state resources. In the Angolan Civil War, UNITA, one of the belligerents, controlled around 70% of the country's diamond production. And in Colombia, enduring insurgencies led by originally leftist groups like the FARC or the ELN obtained most of their resources through their involvement in the cocaine trade. Drugs have similarly played a role in Afghanistan with opium. And of course, if we looked at the Mexican example, which continues to run today, we see that the instability in Mexico and the development of violent cartels is tied to the enormous economic resources generated from their involvement in the trade of cocaine, cannabis, heroin, and methamphetamine. The Democratic Republic of Congo, of course, is a particularly significant case here, because we're dealing with a huge resource-rich country with abundant reserves of copper, gold, diamonds, cobalt, uranium, coltan, oil. And yet, despite this incredible mineral wealth that makes the Congo one of the richest countries in the world in terms of the wealth in its earth, it's a country with one of the lowest indexes of human development across the world. A country racked by political instability and war for decades. And these resources are the key reason for this. It's estimated that up to a third of the profits from Congolese resources go to armed groups. And the resulting conflict, as I've stated already, has killed millions, over 5 million, with an additional 2 million displaced. To put these numbers in wider perspective, the Vietnam War in total killed 1.7 million and the Syrian civil war 500,000. So we often, I think, forget how bloody and deadly the Congolese conflict has been and in a sense continues to be. Speaking of Syria, we have seen in the last decade or so a shift in the epicenter of civil war, away from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Middle East in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq and the Arab Spring. So we've seen civil wars in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and in Yemen. And the interesting thing to note here that these conflicts share a number of traits with the so-called new wars. There's a strong prevalence of non-state actors, and there's a significant role played by resources, particularly oil and gas fields. However, a very strong ideological dimension is also notable, given the obvious prominence of Islamist groups, chief among them ISIS. And that ideological dimension is precisely what new war theorists claim was not really part of the new forms of civil war. In addition, these conflicts have seen the very marked return of the notion of proxy war, in which local powers and major powers compete indirectly through that internal conflict. So we've seen the role played by states such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Russia, or of course the United States, is very significant in the Syrian conflict, and makes for an extremely complicated situation on the ground. A shifting one of complex alliances, and of course has also played a role in the persistence of the conflict for a very long time. Now, in the early modern period, war and revenue extraction, as we saw earlier on, drove the emergence of the state and the monopolization of violence. This was the basis of the conflicts of the early modern period and the trend where military competition effectively led to concentration of state power. Today, of course, conflict in the South is most seemingly accompanied by a decay of post-colonial state structures and a privatization of violence. The important question for us, though, is to think about whether this necessarily needs to be understood as the rise of chaos and disorder, or whether, in fact, perhaps we're in the presence of the emergence of alternative forms of political order. The latter is certainly the view of Mark Duffield, when he explains that rather than expressions of breakdown or chaos, the new wars can be understood as a form of non-territorial network war that works through and around states. Network war is synonymous with the emergence of new forms of protection, legitimacy, and rights to wealth. Rather than regression, the new wars are organically associated with a process of social transformation, the emergence of new forms of authority and zones of alternative regulation. So the dominant idea here really is that if we, of course, approach these conflicts through the prism of Westphalian states, then the decline of the monopoly of violence and the persistence of violence distributed across a territory will look like disorder, like the absence of a political order. But it may well be possible to see what emerges in the aftermath of the collapse of state forms, something like an alternative form of order. One that may involve a much wider horizontal distribution of the means of violence, that might involve a much more persistent systemic level of violence, but is nonetheless a system of patronage, of local authority, of various networks of exchange and legitimacy, and of forms of governance, ultimately. This is what prompts commentators like Philip Cerny to talk of a neo-medievalism. And indeed, this might be the way to think about it. If we think of the world that came prior to states, such as the order of the Middle Ages, one where sovereignty was not exclusive and tied to specific territories, but rather distributed and overlapping, then we might have a better understanding of what is going on in various parts of the world. And we wouldn't necessarily understand the Middle Ages as a period of complete disorder and chaos, but again, one organized according to different principles of organization and governance. And so while any simple reproduction of a medieval model to understand the contemporary world would be, I think, too simplistic, it may nonetheless help us to orient us towards more productive ways of thinking than only as the absence of what we've become used to, which is to say, the state system.